It was an early morning at the airport. Sarah rushed through the terminal, her heart beating fast as she made her way to the gate. Today was going to be a long day, a non-stop flight across the ocean, and she had to be on her best behavior. Her uniform, pressed her shoes, shined her hair neatly tied back. She was a professional, and she had been doing this for years. But there was something about today that felt different. Maybe it was the crowded terminal or the tension in the air, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. As she walked through the airplane's cabin, preparing for the boarding process, she glanced down at her clipboard. The list of first-class passengers was long and familiar: businessmen, lawyers, tech moguls, the usual group of polished, well-dressed individuals, all wearing suits, ties, shoes that gleamed as though they had just been pulled from a store window display. Sarah was used to the routine. First class was always reserved for the highest of society, people who valued appearances, who knew how to conduct themselves, and who respected the unwritten code of flying with class. But then her eyes landed on him, a man sitting by the window in the far corner of first class. He was different. The moment Sarah saw him, she felt a pang of confusion. He wasn't like the others, not at all. He was dressed in a faded t-shirt, too big for his frame, the kind of thing someone would wear lounging around the house. He had on a pair of jeans that looked old, almost worn out, and sneakers that seemed too casual for this type of flight. Sarah couldn't believe it. What was he thinking? Did he not understand where he was? She looked down at her clipboard once more to confirm his seat. He was supposed to be seated in first class. Surely there was a mistake. He didn't look like the kind of person who belonged in a seat that cost thousands of dollars. It made no sense. How could he have gotten a ticket here? Sarah couldn't help but feel irritated. She was a professional, and she had learned over the years to handle all types of passengers. But this one was different. He was breaking all the rules in her mind, at least. She shook her head and tried to focus on the task ahead, but something about him nagged at her. As the boarding process continued, she could see that the other passengers were giving him looks of disapproval, the kind of sideways glances that suggested they shared Sarah's thoughts about his attire. But the man seemed completely oblivious. He just sat there, staring out the window, lost in his own world, barely paying attention to the commotion around him. Sarah found herself wondering what kind of person would wear something like that on a flight like this. But she didn't have much time to think about it. She had to move quickly. She had a job to do. As passengers continued to settle into their seats, Sarah began her rounds, offering drinks and greeting the passengers. As she went, she didn't want to make assumptions, but she couldn't help herself. She had to say something. She had to let him know that this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable. It wasn't about being rude. It was about maintaining the standards of the flight and ensuring that everyone respected the unwritten rules. When she got to his row, she stood there for a moment, gathering her thoughts. She looked down at him. He hadn't noticed her at first, so she cleared her throat politely. He looked up at her, his eyes meeting hers. He smiled a bit, but there was something about his smile that made Sarah pause. It wasn't the nervous smile of someone who had made a mistake. It was more confident, almost knowing. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah began, her tone polite but firm. "I just wanted to mention that some passengers prefer to dress a bit more appropriately for this type of flight. We do have a certain standard here." She said it with a smile, but inside her heart raced. She wasn't sure if she was overstepping, but she felt like it needed to be said. The man didn't react immediately. Instead, he simply nodded his head. He didn't seem offended, just calm, almost detached. And then he spoke. "I see," he said in a low voice, as though he had heard this kind of thing before, but his tone was neutral, almost soothing. Sarah wasn't sure what to make of it, but she quickly moved on, not thinking much about the exchange. She continued with her service, but in the back of her mind she couldn't stop wondering who this man really was and why he looked so out of place. Maybe it was just her imagination, but she had a feeling that this flight wasn't going to be as ordinary as she had hoped. Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off as the hours passed. She moved through the cabin greeting passengers, offering drinks, making small talk, but her mind kept drifting back to that man in the corner of first class. Every time she glanced toward his seat, he was either staring out the window or tapping away at his phone, completely engrossed in whatever he was doing. She tried not to stare, but something about him nagged at her. It wasn't just his outfit anymore. It was his presence. Something about him felt different. It wasn't just that he didn't belong, it was that he didn't seem to care. As the flight continued, Sarah couldn't help but notice the subtle oddities around him. When the meal service began, he didn't seem to be in any hurry like the other passengers, who quickly began to unwrap their trays of food. He just sat there taking his time, his fingers still dancing over the keys of his phone, not even looking at the menu. The crew had passed around. At one point, Sarah walked past him again and couldn't resist stealing a quick glance at his screen. His hands moved swiftly across the device, typing something with incredible speed. It was almost hypnotic. But it wasn't the typing that caught Sarah's attention. It was the brief words she managed to catch as she walked by. Fabric shipment confirmed. She heard him mutter under his breath, launch date set for next month. It was so out of place it didn't make sense. She thought, who talks about fabric shipments in the middle of a flight to Paris? Curiosity gnawed at her, but she tried to push it aside. She had a job to do. She had to focus on the other passengers and get through the flight. But as the plane cruised through the sky, she couldn't help herself. She started wondering about the man more and more. Could he be involved in fashion somehow? Or was she reading too much into it? After all, he didn't look like anyone in fashion. Not the way he dressed, not the way he carried himself. But still the words kept echoing in her mind. Fabric shipment, launch date. Sarah was no expert, but she knew that there was something important about those words, something that suggested he wasn't just a regular passenger who happened to be a little lazy with his attire. It wasn't until the flight began its descent into Paris that Sarah started to feel the weight of the situation building. She was wrapping up the final part of her service when she saw a flurry of movement near the front of the plane. A few of the other flight attendants were talking in hushed tones, their voices low but urgent. She caught a few words. Security's on their way. He's not supposed to be seen. Sarah felt a strange tension in the air, something that made her skin prickle. And as she tried to figure out what was happening, it dawned on her. It was the man in the corner. He was standing now, moving with purpose toward the front of the plane. He was no longer hunched over his phone, his eyes no longer glued to the screen. His posture had changed. His back straightened. His every movement became deliberate, as if he was preparing for something. Sarah couldn't understand it. Was like he had transformed before her eyes. And that's when it happened. The door to the cockpit opened, and two men in dark suits stepped onto the plane. They didn't look like airport security or customs agents. They looked more official, almost out of place. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she watched them approach the man in the T-shirt. They didn't say a word to him, but he nodded as though he expected them. Sarah's mind raced. Who were these men? Why were they waiting for him? The man walked toward the front of the plane with a calm and collected demeanor. The assistants around him stepped aside to make room. They were all so respectful, so deferential, as if they were waiting for someone important to lead them somewhere. Sarah couldn't take her eyes off him. What was going on? As the man reached the front of the plane, Sarah caught a glimpse of his phone screen one more time. A name flashed on the display. She saw it clear as day, a name she recognized, but only from the whispers of the fashion world, a name that had been whispered in her circles, but never fully revealed. She barely had time to process it when the door to the cabin opened, and the two men stepped aside to let him pass. For the first time all flights, Sarah felt a deep sense of dread crawl up her spine. She realized in that moment that the man in the T-shirt, the one she had so carelessly judged, was not who she thought he was. He was something far more than what she had assumed, and she couldn't escape the weight of the mistake she had made. Sarah's heart raced as she watched the man in the T-shirt disappear into the front of the plane. Her thoughts were swirling in confusion and disbelief. She had never felt so uneasy in all her years of flying. She had seen all kinds of passengers, from the overly confident to the quiet and reserved. But this man was different. He carried himself with an air of authority that didn't belong in a seat so casually dressed. And now the two dark-suited men were escorting him, like he was someone important, but important enough to warrant such secrecy. Sarah stood frozen for a moment, wondering if she had misjudged the entire situation, if she had read him all wrong. But the more she thought about it, the more she realized there was something far beyond her understanding happening here. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This wasn't a simple case of a passenger dressed out of place. There was something much bigger unfolding right in front of her eyes. She couldn't stop thinking about the names she had glimpsed on his phone screen. It had been too brief, too fleeting, but it was enough for her to recognize it as one of the most famous names in the fashion world, a name that she had heard in passing, but never thought she'd ever encounter. In person, she had heard the stories of the man who built a fashion empire from the ground up, the man who revolutionized the industry and turned it upside down, but never in her wildest dreams did she think she would see him in real life, much less sitting on her flight. It hit her like a ton of bricks, but she didn't have time to dwell on it. As the flight neared its final descent into Paris, the last leg of the journey, she could feel the air of excitement building among the passengers. Some of them were leaning over the aisles, looking toward the front of the plane, wondering what was going on. Sarah's instincts told her something was about to happen, something big, and she had no idea how it was all going to unfold. As the plane touched down and the wheels screeched against the tarmac, Sarah moved quickly to finish her duties, but her mind was still racing. She couldn't shake the thought of the man, his calm demeanor, the way he seemed to know exactly what was happening around him, the way the assistants treated him like royalty, like he was someone to be respected and admired, but she had no idea who he really was. The plane came to a stop and passengers began to unbuckle their seatbelts. Sarah felt a strange tension in the air. The usual rush of people gathering their things didn't happen. Instead, there was a kind of slow-moving quietness. It was almost as if everyone was waiting for something to happen, a feeling that hung thick in the cabin. Then it happened. The door to the plane opened, and Sarah was stunned as she watched the man in the T-shirt walk past her. Once more, this time he wasn't alone. A group of assistants followed him like shadows, their eyes glued to him, as though he was a king or a celebrity. But what struck Sarah most was the way they moved with purpose. They didn't speak, they didn't acknowledge anyone else. They just followed behind him like a well-rehearsed team. She watched as the man was escorted to a private waiting area in the airport terminal. The crowd of passengers began to filter out of the plane, but Sarah couldn't take her eyes off the scene playing out in front of her. She had heard rumors over the years about high-profile passengers who traveled with private security and special arrangements, but this felt different. There was an air of secrecy about it all, something that made her feel like she had missed something monumental. It wasn't until one of the senior flight attendants passed by her and whispered in her ear that the pieces finally fell into place. "That's him," the attendant said barely above a whisper. "That's the fashion mogul, the one who owns half of the luxury brands in the world, the billionaire." Sarah felt a wave of shock wash over her. She blinked several times, unable to comprehend what she had just heard. She had been standing in the presence of a living legend, someone whose name was whispered in the elite circles of fashion and business. But to her he had just been a regular passenger, someone she had judged for his casual outfit, and now she realized how wrong she had been. Her face flushed with embarrassment as the full weight of her mistake hit her. She had criticized him for his appearance without knowing a thing about him, without understanding who he really was, and the thought of it made her stomach churn. The man she had looked down on wasn't just anyone. He was a billionaire, a creator, a genius, behind some of the most famous fashion lines in the world, and Sarah had no idea. As the last few passengers made their way off the plane, Sarah stood there, frozen, her mind racing with the realization that she had just witnessed something incredible, but had no way of explaining how she had missed it all. She had let her judgment cloud her vision, and now she would have to live with the consequences. Sarah stood at the entrance of the plane as the last few passengers filtered out, her mind still reeling from the discovery she had just made. She couldn't shake the image of the man in the t-shirt walking away, escorted by a small entourage, his casual outfit now feeling like a distant memory compared to the air of authority he had carried with him. The assistants trailing behind him made her wonder how she could have missed all the signs. She had been so focused on his clothes, on his laid-back demeanor, that she hadn't even considered who he might be beneath it all. As the final seatbelt sign clicked off and the hum of the plane settled into an eerie quiet, Sarah walked slowly to the galley, her hands still trembling slightly. She needed a moment to compose herself. She didn't understand how she could have been so blind to the truth, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized how quickly she had judged him, how easily she had dismissed him based on his appearance alone. She leaned against the wall of the galley and closed her eyes for a brief moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. What if he had heard her comments? What if he had been offended by her assumptions? What if he had decided to take action against her? All these thoughts raced through her mind, but there was one thought that stood out among them all. How had she not known who he was? The rumors she had heard about the man, whose name was known only to the highest circles of the fashion world, had never been more than whispers, at least not to Sarah. She had always thought those stories were exaggerated tales that people told to impress one another, but now she realized how naive she had been. She had dismissed him as just another unremarkable passenger. But he wasn't just anyone. He was a genius, a billionaire with an empire built from nothing, and she had stood there unaware of the significance of the moment. Her mind flashed back to the brief exchange they had had when she had spoken to him about his outfit. She recalled his calm smile, the way he had nodded politely at her words, but hadn't seemed fazed by them. It made sense now why he hadn't reacted with anger or irritation, because he wasn't a man who cared about the opinions of others. He was someone who had created an empire that allowed him to dress however he liked without concern for judgment, and the way he had carried himself with such quiet confidence now made perfect sense. The thought of her words reaching him now made her feel sick to her stomach. What if he had been offended by her comment? What if it had ruined her chance to ever make an impression on someone like him? Sarah thought about what kind of influence he must have had, the power he must wield in the fashion world. How could someone like her, who had spent her whole career serving others, ever have a real impact on someone like him? Just as her thoughts began to spiral, the senior flight attendant, who had whispered the truth to her earlier, approached Sarah with a soft expression on her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice quiet. Sarah looked up at her, shaking her head slightly. "I can't believe I didn't recognize him. I just assumed he was another casual traveler," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The older woman gave a small, knowing smile. "Don't be too hard on yourself. We all make mistakes." Sarah nodded, but the weight of the moment still hung heavily on her heart. It wasn't just the embarrassment that was eating at her. It was the realization of what she had missed, what she had failed to see until it was too late. She wondered if he had taken notice of her comment, if he had noticed how she had judged him based on his appearance alone. As she made her way toward the crew exit to head to the terminal, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she had missed an opportunity, one that might never come again. This man, this billionaire, had been right in front of her, and she had failed to see him for who he truly was, not just a passenger, but someone who had the power to change industries, someone who could have changed her life had she only known. She stepped off the plane into the busy terminal, still lost in thought, wondering if she would ever get a chance to redeem herself, or if she had lost her only chance to make a meaningful connection with a man who might have seen potential in her. But now it was too late. All she could do was wonder what could have been. Sarah walked through the bustling terminal, her steps slow as her mind raced with thoughts. She couldn't shake the image of the man disappearing into the crowd surrounded by his team, his assistants, all so formal and respectful. While she had been standing there unsure of who he was, the realization that she had been in the presence of someone so important still hadn't fully sunk in. But one thing was certain now. She would never forget the feeling of missing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. She tried to focus on her duties as she left the plane and entered the crew area, but her thoughts kept drifting back to him, the way he had looked at her with that calm smile that didn't give anything away. He hadn't been upset by her comment, or by the way she had judged him for his casual outfit, but Sarah couldn't help but wonder if he had known all along that she didn't recognize him, that she had underestimated him. The more she thought about it, the more she became aware of how many times she had made assumptions about people based on their appearance. It wasn't the first time she had dismissed someone for not fitting into a mold that she had created in her mind, but it felt different this time. It felt like a wake-up call to the truth of her own prejudices. The way she had taken her job for granted, assumed that she knew everything about the world around her, just because she had been in the air for so long. As Sarah entered the crew break room, she took a seat by the window, trying to clear her head, but it was no use. The memory of the man's presence lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake, no matter how much she tried to distract herself with the mundane chatter of her colleagues who were exchanging stories of their latest flights and their passengers. She couldn't stop thinking about him, how he had moved through the cabin like someone who had already seen everything the world had to offer and still remained unaffected. She wondered about his life, what kind of world. He came from the kind of pressures he must face every day to maintain such an empire. It seemed surreal that someone with that much power had sat just a few feet away from her, and yet she had failed to realize it until it was too late. But it wasn't just the man she was thinking about now. It was the way she had reacted, the way she had assumed things about him, simply because he didn't fit the image of a typical first-class passenger, the way she had allowed her own biases to shape her actions. Sarah felt a deep sense of regret wash over her, the kind of regret that made her question her own self-awareness and her ability to truly understand the world around her. Her phone buzzed, breaking her train of thought. She glanced at the screen to see a message from one of her colleagues back in the US asking her if she was interested in swapping shifts for the next week. A simple enough message, but for a moment Sarah didn't even register it. Her mind was still focused on the encounter with the mysterious man. She found herself wondering if he had known the moment she spoke to him how little she truly understood about him or his world. A part of her wanted to know more. She wanted to find out who he really was, what kind of person could live with such power and influence. But another part of her was afraid to know the truth, afraid that her own mistakes would come to light, and she would be forced to face the fact that she had been wrong about everything. She stood up and walked toward the terminal exit, her head still spinning. She needed air, she needed space to think. But as she passed through the terminal gates, she caught a glimpse of something that made her pause. There, on a large billboard, was the same man she had dismissed earlier, his picture staring down at her with a tagline that read, "The visionary behind the next revolution in fashion." Her heart skipped a beat as she realized the full extent of her mistake. Not only had she failed to recognize him in the moment, but she had also missed the chance to understand just how important this man really was. And as she stared up at the billboard, she knew that this moment would haunt her forever. She had been so caught up in judging him by his clothes, by his appearance, that she had missed the bigger picture, and now it was too late. She stood there for a long time, staring at his face, wondering if she would ever get a chance to redeem herself, or if she had forever lost the opportunity to learn from one of the most influential people in the world. Sarah stood frozen in front of the billboard, her eyes still locked on the man's face, the words beneath him a reminder of her mistake. Every fibre of her being screamed in frustration. She had let the moment slip by without truly seeing who he was, and now the world was telling her exactly what she had missed. She felt a deep sense of embarrassment creeping up from her chest to her throat. It was as though the entire world had conspired to make her see just how wrong she had been. She turned away from the billboard, quickly, her breath shallow. As she tried to steady herself, she couldn't let it get to her. She had to focus on the present. She was in Paris. Now there were other duties waiting for her. She was a professional, and she needed to keep her composure. But the nagging feeling that she had missed something important refused to leave her. She couldn't shake the image of the man, walking off the plane surrounded by his team, his quiet confidence now, like a mocking reminder of her own misjudgment. Sarah made her way through the terminal with slow, deliberate steps. She felt like she was walking through a fog. Every face she passed seemed to blur together, the hum of the busy terminal drowning out in her mind as she tried to gather her thoughts. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the thought that she had missed her chance to understand him, to learn from him. She reached a small cafe in the corner of the terminal where she ordered a coffee and sat by the window looking out at the bustling crowd. Her hands shook slightly as she wrapped her fingers around the warm cup. She had to do something. She had to find a way to make it right. But she had no idea where to begin. It wasn't like she could just walk up to him and apologize. She couldn't erase the judgment she had already passed. But as she sat there staring at the people rushing by, she had an idea, a small flicker of hope, that maybe there was still a way to learn more about him. After all, if he truly was who she now believed him to be, then he would be a public figure. There would be ways to get in touch with him. She could find out more about his story, maybe even understand what had driven him to build such an empire. Her mind raced with the possibilities, but at the same time she felt a wave of doubt settle over her. What if he didn't want to be found? What if he didn't care about what she thought? What if he had forgotten all about her and her ill-informed judgment? After all, he was a billionaire surrounded by a world of power and wealth. Why would he even care about one flight attendant's opinion? She took another sip of her coffee and exhaled deeply, trying to push the doubt away. She couldn't let herself be consumed by fear. She had to try. She had to learn from her mistake and somehow find a way to make it right. Later that afternoon, as Sarah made her way to her hotel room, she couldn't stop thinking about the man and the billboard, his face still etched in her memory. She pulled out her phone and began typing his name into the search engine. Her heart raced as the results flooded the screen. Articles, interviews, and business news, all pointing to the same person, the man she had unknowingly shared a flight with. The more she read, the more she was stunned by the extent of his influence in the fashion world, the way he had started with nothing and built an empire that rivaled the biggest brands in the world. He wasn't just a designer, he was a visionary, someone who had completely changed the industry and redefined what it meant to be successful in a world driven by image and reputation. Sarah scrolled through articles detailing his rise to power, his groundbreaking work, and the revolutionary ideas he had introduced into the fashion world. She read about his humble beginnings and the way he had defied expectations at every turn. And as she read on, she felt a deep sense of regret for ever underestimating him. How could she have been so blind? But it was more than just regret that filled her now. It was a newfound admiration, a desire to understand his journey, to learn from his experiences, to see if there was anything in his story that could teach her about overcoming judgment and finding success in a world that often valued the wrong things. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard as she searched for ways to contact him or his team. There had to be a way to reach him, to apologize, or at least try to make up for her mistake. But as she scrolled through page after page of articles, she realized how far out of reach he truly was. The world that surrounded him seemed impenetrable. But Sarah wasn't about to give up. She had made a mistake, but that didn't mean she couldn't fix it. Somehow she had learned something valuable from this experience, and she wouldn't let it slip away. She would find a way to make her mark, to show him that she had learned and grown from the encounter that had changed everything. The next few days passed in a blur for Sarah. She couldn't stop thinking about the man and his empire. The world he lived in felt so far removed from her own, yet somehow it felt like a door had opened a crack, and she was determined to step through it. Even if she didn't know exactly where it would lead, she spent hours researching his life, reading every article, every interview she could find. But there was one thing that stuck with her more than anything else: the way he had defied the expectations of everyone around him, how he had risen from humble beginnings to dominate an industry built on appearances. She couldn't help but admire him. The more she learned, the more she understood why he carried himself with such quiet confidence, why he hadn't reacted to her judgment with anger or frustration. It was because he didn't need to prove anything to anyone. He had built his legacy on his own terms, and nothing could shake that. But as Sarah sat in her hotel room, late one night, she realized something that made her pause. What if he hadn't even noticed her mistake? What if he had no idea who she was? What if he had already forgotten about the flight altogether? That thought filled her with a strange sense of both relief and disappointment. She wanted to make things right. She wanted him to know that she understood now. But the fear of reaching out and making things worse held her back. Sarah had never been someone who took risks. She was a flight attendant. She knew how to keep things running smoothly. She was good at her job. But stepping outside of her comfort zone was something she wasn't used to, and yet now more than ever it felt like the right thing to do. She took a deep breath and pulled out her phone again. This time, she wasn't searching for more information about him. Instead, she was searching for a way to contact him. She knew it wouldn't be easy, and the chances of him even seeing her message were slim, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that this was her chance to do something bold, to take the first step toward making amends. It took her several hours to find the right contact information, and even then she hesitated, her thumb hovering over the send button. As she stared at the message she had written, she knew it wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was an apology, an acknowledgement of her mistake, and a request for the chance to learn from him to be better. The message was simple but heartfelt, and after what felt like an eternity, Sarah hit send. She sat back in her chair and waited, her mind racing with doubt. What if he never saw it? What if he didn't care? What if she had ruined her only chance at redemption? But then something unexpected happened the next morning. Sarah woke up to an email notification. Her heart leaped in her chest as she opened it and saw the subject line: apology and request. Her hands shook as she read the brief reply. I received your message, and I appreciate your honesty. It takes courage to admit mistakes. If you truly want to learn and grow, come to my studio in Paris. I'm hosting a workshop next week. Consider it an opportunity. The words seemed surreal to Sarah as she read them again and again. She couldn't believe it. He had seen her message. He had acknowledged her apology. And more than that, he had offered her an opportunity, something she hadn't expected, something that felt like a second chance. Her heart raced as she sat there staring at the screen, the weight of the moment sinking in. She had no idea what to expect when she walked into that studio, what kind of world she was about to enter. But she knew one thing for sure: this was her chance to make things right, to prove that she was more than the mistakes she had made. She took a deep breath and began to prepare for the next chapter of her journey. She had no idea where it would lead, but for the first time in days, she felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. She had been given a chance to learn from the very person she had once judged, and this time she wasn't going to let it slip away. The days leading up to the workshop felt like a blur to Sarah. Each morning, she woke with a mixture of excitement and anxiety, her mind racing with questions about what awaited her at the studio. Would she be out of place, surrounded by people who had more experience, more knowledge than her? Would she be able to prove that she wasn't just the flight attendant who made a mistake? Or would she forever be trapped in that one misjudgment? She arrived at the address in Paris on the morning of the workshop, her heart pounding in her chest, as she stood outside the sleek glass building that seemed to stretch high into the sky. It looked nothing like the world she was used to, the polished walls and modern design standing in stark contrast to the simplicity of her life. As a flight attendant, she had never felt so small, so out of place. But she knew this was where she needed to be. With a deep breath, she stepped inside the lobby, the cool air brushing against her skin. As she made her way toward the elevator, the sound of her footsteps echoing in the otherwise quiet space, she tried to calm her nerves. As she pressed the button to the top floor, where the workshop was being held, she had no idea what to expect. But she knew one thing for sure: she had to make the most of this opportunity. The elevator doors opened, and Sarah stepped out into a spacious open room filled with natural light, large windows, offering a breathtaking view of the city below. Scattered throughout the room were a dozen or so people, all dressed in the kind of high-end fashion Sarah had only ever seen in magazines and on runways. She felt an instant wave of discomfort as she looked around, but she reminded herself that she was here to learn. There was no time to dwell on her insecurities, as she was quickly approached by a woman in a sharp black suit who introduced herself as the workshop coordinator. She smiled warmly and led Sarah to a seat near the front of the room. "The workshop will start soon." The woman said, her voice calm but confident. "Please make yourself comfortable, and we'll begin shortly." As Sarah sat down, she scanned the room once again, catching a glimpse of the man she had once misjudged standing near the front of the room, speaking quietly with one of the other instructors. He seemed so calm, so composed, his presence dominating the space. Even without saying a word, he was a force to be reckoned with. And Sarah found herself feeling more than just awe. She felt a deep sense of respect. The room gradually filled with hushed whispers as more people took their seats, and soon the man she had once judged as just another passenger stepped to the front of the room, his presence commanding the attention of everyone present. There was no doubt in Sarah's mind that he was the one leading the workshop. He didn't need a microphone. His voice was rich with authority and experience. He began speaking about the future of fashion, about breaking boundaries and redefining what success meant in an industry that thrived on perfection. He spoke of creativity and risk, of going against the grain and finding one's own voice. Sarah listened intently as his words resonated deeply within her. She had always admired people who took risks, who created something meaningful. And here was the man who had done just that. His voice was captivating as he spoke of his journey, how he had overcome doubts and faced criticism, just like anyone else, how he had carved out his own path in the fashion world, without following the rules, without worrying about what others thought. He had built his empire, not on appearances, but on authenticity and vision. Sarah felt her heart race as she listened to him, the weight of her previous mistake still heavy on her mind. But as he spoke, something within her shifted. She realized that this was more than just a chance to make amends. It was an opportunity to learn, to grow, to push past the boundaries she had created for herself. After the lecture, Sarah found herself approaching him as he spoke to another group of participants, her palms sweaty, her mind racing with what to say. But as she stood in front of him, he turned and smiled warmly, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of calm understanding. He had seen her hesitation, he had seen her discomfort, and in that moment she realized that he didn't just see her as the flight attendant who had judged him. He saw her as someone willing to change. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice soft but purposeful. "I'm glad you decided to take the leap." In that moment, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. She hadn't expected him to be kind or understanding, but his words gave her the validation she didn't know she needed. "I'm here to learn," Sarah said simply, her voice steady for the first time since she had stepped into the studio. He nodded, his eyes twinkling with a knowing smile. "Then you're already on the right path." And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt like she truly belonged, like this was where she was meant to be.